When we think about American history, we learn about independence, presidents, and world wars. But there's a side of that history rarely taught in classrooms. For over 3 centuries, Native American nations fought to defend their land, their culture, and their very survival against colonial expansion and the growing United States. These conflicts, known as the Native American Wars, have largely been forgotten. This is the story of America's hidden wars. Long before the United States even existed, hundreds of distinct Native American nations flourished across North America. They had organized governments, vast trade networks, rich spiritual traditions, and a deep connection to their land. When European colonists arrived, conflict began almost immediately. These weren't just wars for territory. They were wars for survival. Early conflicts saw native tribes clashing with Spanish colonists, French forces, and British settlers. So, by the time the United States declared its independence in 1776, native nations had already been fighting for generations to protect their homelands. It's a history that started long before the Stars and Stripes. After independence, the new United States began its relentless expansion westward. The government signed hundreds of treaties with Native American tribes, many of which promised permanent land ownership, peaceful coexistence, and protection from encroaching settlers. But these were promises built on sand. As settlers pushed west, hungry for land, most of these treaties were broken. Native lands were taken, often through force or deception. When tribes resisted, the U.S. government frequently responded with overwhelming military action. This policy ignited decades of violent conflict across the continent, known collectively as the Indian Wars. It was an era defined by broken promises and a fight for survival against a nation that refused to honor its own word. Let's talk about some of the major forgotten conflicts. First, Tecumseh's War from 1811 to 1813. Tecumseh, a brilliant Shawnee leader, united multiple tribes to create a formidable resistance against U.S. expansion. His confederacy was one of the first large-scale pan-tribal movements. After his death in battle, native resistance in the Midwest weakened, and vast territories were lost forever. Then there were the Seminole Wars in Florida, stretching from 1817 to 1858. These were some of the longest and costliest conflicts the U.S. Army ever fought. The Seminole people used guerrilla warfare and their intimate knowledge of the swamps to resist removal. In fact, many Seminoles were never defeated. They survived by retreating deep into the Everglades, where their descendants live today. Finally, the Plains Wars, from the 1850s to the 1890s. As railroads and settlers carved up the West, tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Comanche fought fiercely to protect the Great Plains and their way of life. We've all heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, where native forces won a stunning victory against a U.S. Army unit. But that victory was an exception. The long-term outcome was determined by the United States' overwhelming military power and resources. One of the darkest chapters in American history was the policy of forced removal. In the 1830s, the U.S. government forcibly marched thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to distant territories in the West. This brutal journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of men, women, and children died from disease, starvation, and exposure to the harsh elements along the way. This suffering was not an accident. It was the direct result of a deliberate, calculated government policy designed to seize land at any human cost. By 1890, the era of large-scale armed resistance was coming to a tragic close. That winter, U.S. soldiers surrounded a Lakota camp at Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The soldiers were there to disarm the Lakota. A confrontation broke out, and it quickly turned into a massacre. More than 250 Native men, women, and children were killed. Many shot down as they tried to flee. The Wounded Knee Massacre is often seen as the symbolic end of the Indian Wars. But while the armed struggle was over, the fight for survival was not. Even after the wars ended, the assault on Native American life continued. The U.S. government implemented policies of forced assimilation. Native children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their language or practice their religion. The goal was to erase their culture entirely. Yet, Native cultures survived. Through the power of oral traditions, sacred ceremonies, and unbreakable community strength, Indigenous nations preserved their identity against all odds. Today, Native Americans continue that fight not with weapons, but in courtrooms and communities, fighting for land rights, cultural preservation, and the legal recognition they have always deserved. So why are these wars so often forgotten? Why are they footnotes in our history books? It's because they challenge our national myths. They reveal uncomfortable truths about westward expansion and complicate the simple story of American progress. But remembering these wars doesn't weaken our history. It completes it. It forces us to see the full picture, with all its complexities and contradictions. The forgotten Native American wars were not small skirmishes. They were major conflicts that shaped the borders, the politics, and the very identity of the United States. To remember them is not about assigning blame. It's about honoring the truth. It's about acknowledging incredible resilience and the enduring spirit of survival. History isn't only written by the winners. Sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that were almost erased. Thanks for watching.